Well, thank you very much, Jenny, and it's a pretty cool weekend to be here. I mean, it's a terrific weekend if you're a rabbit or a dog. Not so good if you're a swan or a wallaby, but, you know, them's the breaks. An hour ago, I came out of that wonderful swimming pool down under the bridge, having done my 64 lengths. I know, Richard, you've been tearing up the tracks. No pressure on the rest of you. The most important advice I was ever given in politics is the most important meeting that you have every day is the meeting that you have with yourself. So take it to heart. You know, I'm just in awe of the intellectual, academic heft that is arrayed around this table, as Gary Becker would call it, just awesome human capital. But note to self, other than the meeting you have every day with yourself, is you've now got a really, really heavy responsibility to do the heavy lifting in the domains of your choice. So when Jenny and I landed on this topic, I swear it was well before the result of the New Zealand election this time last week. And in the run-up to that election, I convinced myself in the last week that there was going to be this kind of settlement by the voters, that they were going to face down our proportional representation system and elect a first-past-the-post style government, that the centre-right government was going to continue to want to have the three usual support partners around the table, and that the opportunist party, which is called New Zealand First, would be shut out of having any say in the nature of that government. And voila, on Saturday night, that was exactly the result. Now, having boasted a bit about picking the result, the one thing that I wasn't able to achieve, because the voters were of a different disposition, was I hoped that the opportunist party and the righteous party, which is called Conservative, would cancel each other out. As it was, the righteous party didn't make the 5%, but the opportunist party got nearly 10%, which is a bit of a worry. So that sort of sets the scene on sort of my topic today, which are the rewards for responsible governance. And in a sense, the result of the New Zealand election last Saturday night is, you know, I rest my case. That was the reward for responsible governance. And not wanting to indulge in a bit of hubris, because that always is a forerunner of a fall, the Wall Street Journal the next day said, "Land of political contentment. New Zealand rewards the National Party for pro-growth economics." And it concluded on this note, "Mr Key's victory shows that sound policies lead to growth that feeds a virtuous political cycle. Maybe Mr Key will be good enough to swing by the States and tell the Republicans how he does it." Right. Then we had your splendid Henry Eales, who writes in The Australian, which I subscribe to, and he concludes that if there's one lesson from the New Zealand election, it is that the reform pessimists, such as Ross Garnaut and this paper's Paul Kelly, who claim the realities of modern politics have virtually paralysed the advanced democracies, overstate their case. After all, says Mr Eales, politics in New Zealand is every bit as brutal and competitive, and the media cycle as unrelenting as here. But good policy remains good politics, as long as it is managed with consummate skill. And the last of the quotations was from one of our best business journalists, Patrick Smelly, who was over here at one of the G20 bizzos. And he said the Kiwi observers at the G20 were struck by how their Northern Hemisphere counterparts couldn't imagine a high-growth, low unemployment economy with sound banks and government accounts, and were asking how it was done. So I now retire from hubris, but I think that that really bears out my underlying case, which is chance your arm on good policy and put into place the kind of attributes of good governance that make good policy good politics. That is my sort of underlying theme. Now, a really good book, we've been talking all weekend about various ways in which we might address the role of the state and the balance to be struck between the domains of personal, social and economic dynamism and the proper and appropriate role for the state. A very good book I recommend is written by the editor of The Economist and the guy who writes the Schumpeter column, called The Fourth Revolution, the Global Race to Reinvent the State. And I was very struck as I poured my way through that book. I read pretty voraciously, way back to the Federalist Papers, where Alexander Hamilton urged his fellow Americans to decide, and I quote, whether societies of men, in parenthesis women, are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. And that resonates with me. For accident and force, please read, in a modern context, accident and crisis. And I think that's a very good lens through which to address this subject today. I think that our recent history, if you look at Australasia, will record, many times there are references back to the reform eras, respectively in our own countries, in the 80s, in obviously Australia's case, the Hawke-Keating, if you like, settlement, and in our own case, the Roger Douglas and myself reform era. That is often regarded as a new benchmark for the construction and character of public policy. But the truth is, crisis drove that course correction. Everybody knows that. Michael Stutchbury made that very clear on the opening night of this forum. And the default catalyst for the kinds of reforms I'm going to identify this morning, the default position is that course correction happens when it is forced by a crisis. And that is, it might be lamentable, but it's true. So just park that. There are many examples globally now where those kind of wrenching course corrections are occurring, and it's crisis that has driven them, and a culture of entitlement on the part of the populace, complicit with a culture of denial on the part of the politicians, is a lethal cocktail. And so in your own case, with your splendid audit commission, and I read it within minutes of it being published, and it was great yesterday to have Peter talk about inside that dynamic, even in the face of that very, I thought, excellent expose of what Australia faces. I meet many, many business people from Australia who are also in denial. They do not believe that there was a crisis. They do not believe that the fiscal position needs to be addressed. They do not believe that Australia has a productivity and labour market crisis on its hands that will deny you the chance to recover until such time as either crisis or courage makes you address those policy settings. So, there is a certain, if you like, unfortunate aura around the notion that crisis can be the only way in which major course corrections can occur. Now, I don't believe that. I'm an activist, I'm an optimist, and while you've all got glittering CVs, I emerged from university with a sort of bare scrape and an honours law degree, but full of ambition to change the world. And so I'm of the change the world disposition, and I want to, if you like, share with you what I regard as the characteristics of that reform era. Again, back to Henry Eales, just because I wrote it down, but I talked about this entrenched sense of entitlement, complicit with political denial, and again, Henry put it really well, which is as if he was saying that the denial of the politicians, They don't articulate any coherent alternative to the policies that the Commission proposed, as if an indignant sense of entitlement would itself pay the bills and ward off the day of reckoning. Very, very nice turn of phrase. So here's my notion. My notion is that we're full of, the word disruption and probably the word innovation are very overdone, but very powerful drivers in contemporary times. So it's all about disruptive innovation. Today I want to talk about the idea of disruptive governance, not a reset of governance parameters dictated by crisis, but as Alexander Hamilton said, dictated by reflection and choice. So today's a really good forum for reflection and choice. So think about the baseball diamond and think about trying to hit a home run. For my money, in that diamond, there are 4 critical elements, and they are leadership, they are ideas, they are institutions and policy, and they're execution. So let me sketch out my conception of what constitutes gold standard leadership, gold standard ideas, gold standard policy, and gold standard execution. Leadership is really important. It cannot be overrated. And if there was the key to the triumph of John Key in New Zealand, it was all about leadership. And leadership, I've decided, working in both the political and in the business domains, leadership is an art. It's not a science. You can tell if people have got it or they don't. But I think as an art, 2 things have struck me, and you'll all have your own conception of what you recognise and believe to be leadership. But to me, they need both personal and philosophical attributes. There needs to be, if you like, a personal sense of certainty, of courage when it matters, of conviction when it matters, and in a day of 24/7, the politician has to master the art of theatre because so much is about that theatre, how they project themselves. So being personally grounded, personally authentic counts for everything. And if I had a look at the difference between the 2 ranking leaders, if you like, of National and Labour in the New Zealand context, one was authentic, big time, John Key, and one was a complete phony, David Cunliffe. And in the end, I think that counted for a lot. So those personal attributes matter. A sense of conviction matters as well. You saw in Thatcher and Reagan a very philosophical conviction. It doesn't just have to be philosophical conviction, but conviction nevertheless. The ability to have a championship that's willing, if you like, to be at the head of great causes. The difference between a Thatcher and a Reagan and a John Key is Thatcher and Reagan were prepared to expend their political capital to champion causes that were going to have a very, very disruptive and obviously beneficial impact on their nations. In the case of John Key, he's not prepared to use his political capital to champion any reform. He's the master of incrementalism. That didn't defeat him, but may ultimately cost the country. That's another matter. For example, he has put superannuation completely off the table. Not on my watch, he says, notwithstanding that New Zealand has one of the most unsustainable pension systems in the world. It's a problem that he's kicked down the road, not willing to expend his considerable political capital to address that. That's another matter. But leadership matters hugely in terms of being able to carry good governance. So that's the first of my bases. Then we come to ideas, the first principles. And the good news is, and perhaps I would say this as somebody who served as a Minister of Finance, for which I subtitled it the Minister of Reform. Even if your leader doesn't have the same philosophical conviction as you do, which was the case with Roger Douglas, I mean, David Lange had no philosophical conviction around economic reform, nor did my leader. they both knew it kind of had to be done, and you let these ministers of reform work away until they reached breaking point of your own tolerance, when it was time to have a cup of tea and basically press the pause button big time. That's another matter. But it seems to me that you can prevail even when the leadership is not philosophically fired up as the champion of the ideas is. You can still have that détente, if you like, that can be very effective indeed. And so the first principles ideas matter hugely in securing big course correction. So the champion of the New Zealand reform was an idea, not an individual. And that idea was about openness, freedom, liberty, choice, competition, transparency, accountability. Those ideas resonated throughout the whole of the reform agenda. So having an organising idea makes you hugely more effective as an agent of change. So the first principles ideas really matter. And here's my notion of what those first principle ideas drive you to. To me, first of all, what are the domains that matter most in terms of the ultimate performance of a nation? And the domains that matter most are the personal, are the social, and are the economic. And those are the domains where our ideas of liberty are to the fore. And as I said last night in the short sort of dialogue before dinner, what a wonderful time to be a champion of those ideas. They're completely in sync with the mood of the moment. And if you think about those domains, the personal, where you want to allow people to make their own choices, where you want to honour the individual, where you want to think about public policy in those arenas as empowering the individual. And then about the social domain. We had that good debate yesterday about what does community mean. Just as an aside, my reading overnight took me to the Daily Telegraph, and this can only happen in Britain. So they have a Minister for Civil Society, would you believe? And overnight, the Minister for Civil Society was forced to resign for exposing himself on social media to young women who turned out to be a Daily Telegraph sting. So the minister, the Tory party, you can't make it up. So that's the Minister for Civil Society. And in the same news feed, a Tory backbencher has defected to UKIP. And I don't know what the Tory party, which is about to have its conference, believes is the more obscene. But there you go. So, the idea of the social domain, which we spent good time on yesterday, I like Edmund Burke's Little Platoons. And I used the example in a sort of intervention from the bench yesterday of the Christchurch earthquake. It's such an amazing example of how important it is to centre activism in the little platoons. Because when that earthquake hit, as I said, it wasn't the government that was there to help in the immediate aftermath. It was the social domain, individuals, communities, volunteers organising themselves and getting communities back into some semblance of functioning. Of course the government had a role. Helping hand, insurance regimes, should have been bolder in terms of getting out of the way regulatory interventions that stops the rebuild happening faster than it should. But for all of that, it was a salutary lesson in how important it is to have strong, functioning social systems, whether they be families, friends, communities, groups, volunteers. And it was just a wonderful example that resonates hugely in our body politic around how important it is never to surrender those kinds of powers to governments. And economic dynamism. I mean, we all know I talked about disruptive governance. If you talk about disruptive economics, the power now of innovation, the ability of new ideas to get legs, to create business models, to think about the addressable market, to raise capital in public markets, to capitalise on those very lucrative international markets for, to me, distance is not the issue. It's the power of innovation, our ability to commercialise our smarts, and that's not something that a government can do. Good ideas can come from anywhere and everywhere. They don't have to come from a publicly funded research institute or a university or a specially blessed sector, as governments seem to do. I tangled recently with your business council who've got this, no, they say we're not picking winners. We just think there are domains where the government should be more. So there, you call it the way it is. So it seems to me that those, in thinking about the ideas, those are the domains, the personal, the social, the economic, where it's very clear that the first mover, the prime mover, comes from individuals, their ideas, their inventions, their investment, their commitment, and their sheer application of energy and talent to ideas that puts them into commercial models capable of making it in a world market. So if you think about that, then that argues for policies of free trade, no protection, of deregulated labour markets, of ensuring that as we power up our human capital, we employ competitive regimes to do that, and Andrew will talk about that later on. So if you then say those three domains, in sort of your driving the ideas, belong to the individual, not the state, then I come to the fourth domain, which is the state, which does have proper roles. And my huge lament has been that the state for so long in our kind of societies, and I've worked with many governments all over the world, and it tends to be the same type of characteristic. The trouble is that by the state extending itself where it's got no proper use, no proper utility, where it wastes resources and crowds out private endeavour, what the state is doing is junking its absolutely critical capital. Because if you see a failed state in a failed business, you are much more liable to have a very jaundiced view about the state, full stop. So if you go to a lot of Latin American countries and look out Australia and New Zealand, if Latin America ever gets its act together, they are real powerhouses. They can be huge competitors, and they're weighed down by appalling governance and public policy. Just look at Argentina as an example. And the trouble in those countries, really good young people that I could assemble in Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay, just like you, Chile, just like you, they are so disdainful of the state. They don't pay their taxes because they say, we're just pissing it up against a corrupt wall. Why would we do that? And it's just a more extreme example of the state wasting, expending its critical moral capital by trying to operate in domains where it's got no right to be, it's got no expertise to be, it's got no efficiency to be. And so you come back then to what are the core sacred roles of the state where only a well-performed state can operate. I've just been at the Mont Pelerin conference in Hong Kong, and there was a very good paper given, I know we've got a reserve banker here, by John Taylor, who's sort of noted for his inflation, monetary policy, Taylor rule expertise. But he gave a lovely, before he got on to monetary policy, he gave a lovely rendition of what constitutes the principles of economic freedom. And I thought he was right on the money. He said, a predictable policy framework based on the rule of law with strong incentives drawn from reliance on the market system and a clearly limited role for government. I think that's a very, very nice rendition of thinking about the proper domain of the state. Let me take you into another world, which is China, because China is now, for our economies, China has been the main game. In Australia, you're into mining. In New Zealand, we're into dining. At the moment, your economy is on the blink because demand for mining has reduced in China. The New Zealand economy is still being powered up because demand for dining, particularly babies and infant formula, has been driving a good deal of our economy. I work with a really wonderful chap who is sort of like a sovereign debt type specialist, and he's talked about how is it that a lot of countries like China are never able to reach the next stage. You know, you get the early productivity drives that come from, you know, labour into the market, infrastructure, government pumping up the economy, but never quite make it to what he calls the level of the fourth productivity, that there's a ceiling there. And again, it goes back to the role of the state. He talks about when you move from a state whose economy runs on mega projects, like the electrification of the Soviet Union, which is controlled from the top and needs massive heavy industry input, to a world of fashion, smartphones, tablets, insurance, Starbucks, everything changes. You need, and again, this is his prescription, this is like John Taylor in other words, you need a system of a society of free and creative souls, an education system that nurtures them, and a legal and political system that allows them to be so. You need to let the market sort out resource allocation because central planning can no longer master the information flow to do the job. You need a financial system that directs savings to productive investments and can price risk instead of one that acts as an instrument of government. You need free trade to promote competition and choice, and you need the liberalisation of exchange rates. So again, that's just another way of thinking about what is the role of the state. So that gives you a bit of a sense of what I would regard as gold standard organising ideas. Individual prime mover for personal, social and economic spheres, the state thinking very carefully about what its core roles are. The next of my diamonds is institutions, which is how do you bake in institutions and rules that basically keep the bastards honest. So what are the gold standard rules for good governance? I'll just use monetary and fiscal policy. You know, we woke up, Australia, a little bit later than New Zealand, but nevertheless, maybe our performance was more wretched than yours and our crisis more intense. It was. So we woke up to the notion that if you want well-performed monetary policy, you absolutely take it out of the hands of politicians. You have them set the framework, the institutional framework. You have autonomous but accountable central bank, and for my money, you have inflation targeting and rules around that. And that has made monetary policy well-behaved through all the political cycles. You no longer get this, you want to elect the government, you have a big inflationary burst, and then you have the hangover after the party, as it were, when the punch bowl's taken away. So that's Exhibit A in terms of gold standard institutions. Exhibit B, I think, is in fiscal policy, which Peter talked about quite a lot yesterday, and which I'm very intensely focused on, and was in my political career. And that is getting fiscal institutions that basically bound political choices. I wanted to get a fiscal set of rules that mirrored different domains, but mirrored in its character the monetary policy domain. So my Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1994, so that's a hell of a long time ago, basically set in place a set of rules. First of all, we had proper accounting. Why governments account as if they were basically a little kid saving with a tin into which they put their money, cash tin, just big as belief. So New Zealand went in the end of the 80s onto generally accepted accounting practice. Every agency of state has a P&L, every agency of state has a balance sheet, and you know what your contingent liabilities are, you know what your asset base is, and you can take a portfolio approach to your government ownership. You can budget on the basis of outputs, not inputs, and you can get clear accountability. As a minister, I had a contract with my treasury. This is what I want to buy, this is what I want to cost, and I'm buying those things because this is the outcome I want to achieve. So in the set of fiscal rules that I basically nailed up on the Minister of Finance's wall were about prudent levels of debt, were about accountability and transparency, were about securing budget balance over time, were about predictability in tax rates, were most importantly around publish and be damned. So we've just had a general election. This came out 6 weeks before the election. It's the pre-election economic and fiscal update. It means no government ever again can campaign on the basis of fiscal profligacy and then get into office and say, oh, if only I'd known. The books were so wretched, I would never have promised that. And so you've got a compounding difficulty. A, you've got bad fiscal policy, and B, you lose your political moral capital because you break your promise. And so 6 weeks before the election, all laid out in balance sheet style, this is the state of the books, completely changed the nature of the political debate in New Zealand. I'm not saying there aren't more iterations to improve it, there are, but nevertheless, it has tamed the fiscal beast, and it means that New Zealand is one of the few countries in the world now in surplus and able to make quality decisions off a prudent fiscal base. So getting in place through rules and transparency and institutions, those kind of frameworks are very important in terms of disciplining public policy over a cycle. The second part of that institutions is in fact the policy setting. So the policy choices made are very important. And for my money, the most important thing that public policy should be doing at the moment is in thinking about, I talked yesterday about this passport. What do citizens need in a modern world? They need a passport they need a ticket to the game. In a dynamic, open, innovative and market-driven world, they need a ticket to the game. And so in my view, all of the lens around fairness, education, opportunity, social policy should be around what are we doing to ensure that our citizens do have a ticket to that game. And for me, that argues for radical change of education, radical rethink of the entitlement mentality, radical rethink about why it is that we have dysfunctional families that produce dysfunctional kids, that produce disruptive citizens. And so, you've got these Berlin walls of health, education, social policy, dare not touch. The idea that the state should be the funder, the supplier, the regulator, the whole 9 yards, is completely out of sync with the passport we need. In New Zealand, about a third of kids come out of the school system, and if you regard the education intervention as a way of fixing a principal-agent problem, if you've got parents that are dysfunctional themselves, don't care about the kids and their opportunity, the only reason for the state intervention is to break that cycle. A third of young kids coming out of New Zealand have no functional educational attainment, have no ability to participate in the kind of world that we know is emerging, are not able to take their place as productive citizens, and they don't have the passport. And to me, that argues for very radical change indeed. So I'm sort of starting to get out of time. So that's a little flash on policy. So I'd take education, health, and social policy as the 3 areas that we really need to concentrate our policy firepower on. Last is execution. And for me, the notion, I'm now talking about the state. We've got here, you're a policy consultant, right? You're in the field of how the agents of the state can better perform. I mean, we absolutely need modern management systems inside the state sector. How do we best do that? We best do it by having competitive forces. We have proper performance management systems, human resources and financial resources inside the state sector. Think carefully about the role of the state. If the intervention should be just funding, not provision, if the intervention needs to be maybe just regulatory framework, not ownership or purchase, there are very, I think, important ways in which we ought to think about, having decided the state has a role, how can it do it in the most efficient way? There's a real warning in this. Some countries embark upon, performance management and reform of the state apparatus without thinking about what is the role of the state in the first instance. So all they end up is doing dumb things more efficiently. And if you think about the impact of technology and e-government, I heard a splendid guy from Estonia on our national radio last week saying the last thing that you want to do by applying technology to a dysfunctional state apparatus is to amplify a mess. I stopped the car and wrote that down because I thought it was a very nice quote. So, technology allows us to do a lot, but that's a second order issue in my view. The first thing is to rethink both the structure of the state apparatus and the interventions that are appropriate for the state. So let me wrap up, and I'm going to use John Eales, I'm a big rugby nut. We had Concilium recently, and Jenny will testify. We had this wonderful event at Sanctuary Cove where it was so cold, it was amazing. So we had the All Blacks facing off against the Wallabies, and the Wallabies really thought they were in with a chance. So there was a room, imagine, 90 Aussies and about 5 Kiwis. And the first thing that happens is that Richie McCaw gets sent off and a penalty goal is kicked. So there we are, no captain on our side and 3 up on your side. So they were in for a good night until the inevitable happened. But on the morning of that match, John Eales, who I really rate, wrote a wonderful column about what the Wallabies needed to do to win. Maybe they just reinvent him and reclone him because he won a fair bit in his day. And he said that a winning hand is about preparation and performance. And that's sort of another way to think about the state-citizen-individual balance. The state domain should be about preparation. Institutions, infrastructure, getting that passport right. That should drive the intervention logic. So that suggests a state that in character is small in size, really focused on those domains that are only the sacred domains of the state. Think the John Taylor type formula. And so you've got, it's small in size, it's smart in its interventions. It preserves its currency for what really matters. That's the preparatory part. That's the state. And then in respect of the personal, social and economic domains where you're going to get performance, that's where individuals and firms should be in the ascendancy. Take note, Business Council of Australia. So, 3 shifts in my view are called for. First of all, in politics. I think there are 3 great causes in life: nation building, business building, and the stuff on which everything is built, which is the family. And I've been lucky enough to operate in all 3 domains. And politics and policy matter. They matter a lot. So rehabilitating the vocation of politics, and I wrote this before, who was it yesterday that said you should all become politicians? Peter Boxall, was it? Was it Peter? Yeah, right. So I wrote this before he gave that opinion, but let me reinforce it. I think to rehabilitate the vocation of politics is important, and I take my hat off to John Key. 25% of his caucus are now new, and you hope in that talent there'll be some agents of change. And it's only going to come when you get well-performed, well-anchored, people like you who spent a weekend doing this. So, I really do encourage you. If that's where you think you can be your best and brightest, give it a crack. Secondly, policy must trump populism. Gold standard policy with conviction, authenticity, properly measured, bounded by rules, that kind of policy can turn up trumps in terms of what it is that we all want from a government, which is to preside over, a creation of wealth, opportunity for individuals, and the pursuit of, health and happiness, all those things. Good public policy must trump populism. And finally, ideas matter most because the state has to go on reinventing itself. They're going to be disruptive notions, things that you and I have never heard about or talked about. And so I want to end with a very quirky woman, Jenny will attest, called Deirdre McCloskey, who spoke at the Mont Pelerin Society. And she had a wonderful call to arms, so I'll end on this basis. She said the first controversial point here about our economic history is that the enriched world cannot be explained by the accumulation of capital. As to the contrary, economists have argued from Adam Smith through to Karl Marx to Thomas Piketty, and that the very name of capitalism implies our riches were not made by piling brick upon brick, bachelor's degree on bachelor's degree, bank balance on bank balance, but by piling idea upon idea. The bricks, the BAs, the bank balances were of course necessary. Oxygen is necessary for a fire. But she's basically saying, I try to show here in her work that better ideas in technology and institutions, not capital accumulation, did the trick. So there it is, that's a challenge for you. Grab the ideas, refine them, and act on them. Thank you.